the 1820s in Pennsylvania, 90% of the state's residents were farmers. Agricultural work dominated Pennsylvania life during the 18th and 19th centuries. And if you're trying to find your Pennsylvania ancestors and make sense of their life, you really need to understand what farming was like then. This is Denise Allen at PA Ancestors, and I'm joined in this episode by author Dr. Sally McMurry, whose book Pennsylvania Farming, A History and Landscapes details the life of everyday people working in those Pennsylvania farms from 1680 all the way up through modern times. Knowing this farming culture will help you as a genealogist learn what records you need to seek on your ancestors. And honestly, this book filled in so many gaps in my knowledge. I was thrilled to be able to interview Sally and have her share some of those pieces of knowledge with the audience. I really hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and here's Sally. Sally McMurry, I want to welcome you to the podcast. I am super excited that you're here. You are Professor Emerita of History at Penn State University. You wrote this book, which I absolutely adore and love. It explains so much about my ancestors, and I'm like, I just hope she will come on the podcast. What's your inspiration for writing it? And just tell us a little bit about yourself.
The story goes back to the 90s. I was just looking up today. I served on the State Historic Preservation Board from 1997 to 2003. And the main job of that board is to review all the National Register nominations for the state and to approve or not as to whether they'll get sent on to the keeper for listing. So we would get nominations for properties in Philadelphia, for all over the state, all different kinds of buildings, historic districts, and so on. So I learned how that process worked. And for several categories of properties, we had a tool that was sort of like a meta document called a context. So for example, for I think it was bituminous coal properties, there was a big document that explained all the different kinds of structures and buildings and landscape features you would find in a typical bituminous coal landscape, and explain what each was and what the significance was and what they should have in order to be worthy of listing. So you didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time you looked at as individual property. You could just plug into that context and say, oh, well, here we have a bituminous property in Westmoreland County, and we look at our context and we can see that it's not eligible or it is eligible or whatever. So we didn't have to go and look through all the sources for every single property. And being an agricultural historian and living in Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of farms, I wondered why there wasn't one for agriculture. Because it would have been very handy. Every time we had a discussion about a farm, it was torture because nobody had any idea how to evaluate a farm for his significance. So I had a couple colleagues who worked in the State Historic Preservation Office, and we started talking about this, and we put in a few funding applications, which got denied. So we worked on this for several years. And then one of my colleagues in the Historic Preservation Office struck up a relationship with someone in PennDOT, who was a cultural resources person, University of Delaware trained, handling impact statements on her side. And so the two of them were working together on a lot of projects. And this woman was in PennDOT, they have money. So we ended up pitching the project to PennDOT and did a pilot, and they liked it. One reason they liked it was that the first time they used it, they saved a lot of money because they were looking at two different routes, and we were able to say, well, this farm property here is compromised and this one here isn't. And so anyway, so then they funded the whole state in stages for the context, and I became the principal investigator. And I think something like 27 Penn State students worked on this project as interns or researchers. And then I had a couple colleagues We did field work all over the state to generate the landscape information. And then we did a lot of research in the archives to understand the agricultural history. So we had this immense document at the end of it all. And we have a website, which you can still access, called the Pennsylvania Agricultural History Project. And I think it works very well. It's in constant use. It's actually in use in other states because other states don't have agricultural context. They look to us if there's something reasonably close. But it's everything had to be in a certain format. There's a lot of overlap and repetition and bureaucratic language. And there was so much cool stuff that we found out there and in the archives that I thought, gee, this really should see the light of day in a more accessible form. So that's really why I came to writing this book.
You can tell when you read this book that it is a labor of love. Like, you enjoyed the subject that you wrote about. I can tell that. Yeah. And the depth and breadth of knowledge. So for people reading this that are genealogists, you cover the major historical events at the time, like the Whiskey Rebellion, and give us the whole background about how much whiskey was produced on farms as a means of income, so this is why the rebellion was important. It wasn't just a bunch of people got angry one day about taxes. I mean, it had a whole backstory to it. But you're covering the roads, you're covering how the different regions of the state interacted with each other, how they interacted with neighboring states, transportation on rivers or the lack thereof during a lot of times. It's wonderful. And I can tell, I mean, how long did you spend on this? I mean, really?
Well, if you count the time that I spent doing the agricultural history project, the context, that took from 2003 to 2012.
Okay.
And then I think I first pitched the book project maybe around 2015. Okay. And it was published in 2017. And I did add a good chunk. The original, the National Register really focuses on properties older than 50 years unless they're truly exceptional. Okay. So the context only went up to 1960. And so much has happened in Pennsylvania farming since then. And we deliberately excluded the whole Amish and plain sect question because at that time, there was talk of doing a separate context document for them. And there wasn't anything. So Rodale, J.I. Rodale and Paul Keene were important figures in the organic movement from Pennsylvania, and there wasn't anything about them in the document either. So I added a chunk. So I had to do the work for that. It was delightful. It wasn't, it was really fun.
Yeah. I can tell, like, it has a little bit of this, hey, here's this really cool thing I found out about people. And, here's the, why they had a lime kiln and what they used it for and how it got from their property, to a market to sell. And it's the whole context of people's lives, which we're so missing when we look just at straight documents doing research. Right. I wanted to ask you about, I think this one, because you brought up the Amish question, and I live near Amish farms. I drive a few miles down the road. I see the Amish with their horse and buggy. I see them plowing the field, and I think, I know what it was like to farm in Pennsylvania early. Here it is. It looks like this. And pretty quickly into the book, you kind of bust the myth of the German farmer being a neat and tidy farmer, and actually inform us that people threw trash out their windows and there were tree stumps through the fields and they were battling nature, extensively. I mean, it's just...
Well, it's really important to be true to the record. Yeah. And there's a lot of documentation about the way people in the in the colonial and early and national period used the landscape, or abused it, I guess you might say. So I think it was being true to the evidence. That's what a historian tries to do. So I didn't set out with a kind of destructive intent, I guess, but I did want to set the record straight. I did want people to understand that the idea of the tidy German farmstead is a it's a cultural myth that served a certain purpose in its day and probably still does now, but it's not necessarily related to the way people actually lived.
As you were compiling this book and doing your research, going around the state, what was the thing that surprised you the most out of all the places, kind of like in all the time periods? Was there a particular thing that stood out to you, or maybe something that delighted you in terms of a story or a location?
I don't know if I really have a list of most, but I guess one thing that was really fun was starting to be able to see the architectural or landscape expression of a particular system and then seeing it everywhere. So in Lehigh County, for example, they adapted the Pennsylvania barn for potato storage. And there's certain telltale signs that you would probably not notice at all if you didn't understand what was going on. And that's so cool to figure that out and then go around and say, oh, here's one. Oh, we passed that one before. Look at that. Same with adaptations for sheep. That was another one that I kind of figured out through book learning, if you will, and then went out in the field and I just saw it everywhere in the Great Region to some extent. So that was fun. I think it was very interesting to understand that every farm produced the same thing in the 19th century. You hardly came across an area where they didn't have the same grains, the same hay, a few livestock, butter, and so on. But the places looked so different because of the different emphasis and the cultural background. And I found that intriguing because I think that the tendency among scholars is to talk about diversified agriculture as just a thing in itself without any internal differentiation. Like if it's diversified, we don't have to think about it because that's all we need to know about it. But there's so many different kinds of diversification. And that was interesting to sort of try to puzzle through. That took me a long time. I was surprised to see so many small self-provisioning buildings cared for and even built new in the 20th century. That surprised me. Because again, you think, oh, people stopped making butter or they stopped smoking meat. But there's so many of these buildings out there that were clearly in use more recently than you would expect. That surprised me.
Yeah,
And
that's interesting.
privies, so many, 20th century privies. And I got back into the office and I looked at all these records and all the estimated dates we had for these privies. And I thought, what is going on here? Because of course, that rural areas got plumbing late, but this is really late. And this was in a period when people had electricity and even freezers, and they didn't have a toilet indoors. So that kind of bent my mind around a little bit.
So how late are we talking about it? Is this like 1940 or late, or?
Well, 50s even later.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. If you look at the stats, my husband actually pointed this out to me that, well, wait a minute, if rural people picked up freezers really fast, right? You can see why.
Sure.
If you put those stats next to the ones about plumbing, you realize that there was a small group of people who had a freezer and no indoor plumbing. So it's really a lot of the privies that we saw were 40s and 50s, and were probably in use fair period after they were built.
Well, that paints a completely different picture of somebody that I'm researching in 1910 in Clearfield County. I have to double check. Like, I can't make assumptions,
Right.
About how they were living, if they were living in town versus on a farm.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing you pointed out in your book is how people interacted with each other. And I didn't realize there was so much indentured farm labor and that they switched farms. So if we're watching our ancestors kind of change around just slightly within a county, I mean, that could be one reason why. Like, well, why did they go from here to here?
Right. Well, actually, the Yeah, tenant labor is a little bit different from indentured labor in
Okay.
that if you're an indentured worker, you're bound by a contract and you're working under somebody. If you're a tenant, you have occupancy of a whole farm and you're working that whole farm, but you're renting the farm from somebody. But yeah, turn is much greater than you might think. You think of rural life as being kind of static and permanent, but it's not. It wasn't. And some
Yes.
people moved every year.
Yeah, and I got that from your book. You know, sometimes I have a tendency when I get to my rural ancestors to think they were more boring than my city ancestors because my city people were going to the theater, and I can look at the historical surveys of cities and see the buildings and think, oh, you know, maybe they went to the opera and, you know, or something. But I, I realize how not just hardworking my rural ancestors were, but also lively. I really admire how they were able to communicate across hundreds of miles somehow, or just travel hundreds of miles doing cattle drives or trading or
Mm-hmm.
the butter that women produced and supported their farm. I mean, it's a whole different picture of these people. They're no longer boring.
Yeah, people were very social. They had to be to get things done that they needed to get done. I mean, that's another myth that I tried to challenge a bit is the whole idea of self-sufficiency. You can do self-provisioning work, but the self-sufficiency is really more in a community level than a farm level. So you really had to depend on one another, and people were constantly going back and forth and mixing work and social life a lot.
So it's a whole different picture. So for genealogists that want to purchase this book, it was a little tricky. I purchased the one copy Amazon had, and it took them a week to get it to me, which is unusual for Amazon. So where can people purchase this? What's the best place?
Well, I do say Amazon now in COVID times because you can't go to a bookstore, but the University of Pittsburgh Press also sells it directly from the press, and you can get either the Kindle version or the hard copy version from them.
And I'll put the link in the show notes. And for people listening, if you subscribe to the University of Press newsletter, they do give you a discount on your first book order. Not that I've taken advantage of that, because I totally did at one point for some other books that I ordered early in the pandemic. So, Sally McMurry, I wanted to thank you for being on the show and sharing with us this most wonderful book, Pennsylvania Farming, History and Landscapes. And for those genealogists listening, if you have a passion for the housing that your ancestors lived in, the barns, the buildings, that's covered in this book too, as well as their daily life, what they produced. It's a fabulous treasure for genealogists, family historians. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
That was Dr. Sally McMurry, and the name of her book again is Pennsylvania Farming, A History in Landscapes. And I just want to say again how much this book really impacted my research in terms of my Pennsylvania ancestors. I didn't know anything about the lifestyle of tenant farmers here in Pennsylvania. I knew that there was indentured farmers, but tenant farming I didn't know anything about. I assumed that was something that happened in other states. And I have a whole new set of records that I can seek on my ancestors that were all across the state in central Pennsylvania. And for a family farm that was closed down in 1945 in the southeastern part of the state, I finally figured out all the economic forces at work during that time period, which I really never got before until I read this book. So be sure to check out the link in the show notes to purchase the book. And be sure to check out paancestors.com for other articles on genealogy in Pennsylvania. And I hope this episode helps you make new discoveries on your Pennsylvania ancestors.